Welcome back to Peace in the Shadows. Tonight, I'll take you into the cold, dimly lit corridors of an old hospital in Boston, St. Mary's. By day, it's a place of medicine, order, and science. But by night, the walls whisper, shadows linger too long, and the past refuses to stay buried. This is the story of Daniel Morgan, a young doctor who believed in nothing but logic, until he stepped into a nightmare that blurred the line between life, death, and something far darker. Turn off the lights, let the silence settle around you, and listen closely, because once the doors of St. Mary's close, not everyone finds their way back out. The corridors of St. Mary's Hospital never slept. Even past midnight, the fluorescent lights hummed, and the air buzzed faintly with electricity, like static clinging to skin. The white tiles on the floor gleamed faintly under the overhead lights, polished to an antiseptic shine, though no matter how often the custodians scrubbed, a faint undertone of age and sickness clung to the walls. Daniel Morgan pulled his coat tighter across his shoulders and tried to ignore the sense that the building itself was breathing. He was 24, a medical intern with tired eyes and caffeine-stained teeth. Halfway through another 12-hour shift, he'd told himself he was used to this by now long nights, patients who hovered between life and death, the constant demand to remain calm and rational. But no textbook had prepared him for the way the hospital felt at night. The building that seemed bustling and orderly by day transformed into something uncanny after dark. Empty beds loomed like skeletal frames. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, and every sound, from the squeak of rubber soles to the hiss of oxygen tanks, seemed magnified. Daniel wasn't supposed to believe in ghosts. His father had been a biology professor, his mother a nurse, and he'd grown up surrounded by logic and science. But lately, logic felt thinner than it used to. He hadn't told anyone, not even his sister Emily, about the dreams. For weeks now, he had woken up, drenched in sweat, the image of a man in a bloodied lab coat standing at the end of his bed. The figure never moved, never spoke, just stood there with his face obscured, and every time Daniel woke, one name was seared into his mind like a brand: Dr. William Carter. Daniel tried to shake the thought away as he made his rounds. The night was quiet, only a handful of patients asleep in their rooms, monitors softly ticking out proof of life. He checked vitals, scribbled notes, refilled 4 bags. Routine kept his hands busy, and for a while it kept his mind quiet. But the silence pressed in from all sides, so complete it felt almost deliberate. It was around 2 in the morning when he first heard it, the creak of wheels on tile. Daniel froze, halfway down the hall, his clipboard tight in his grip. He glanced back. Down the corridor, an empty wheelchair was rolling forward, slowly, its wheels turning with agonizing precision. He waited for someone to appear behind it, pushing, but the hallway remained empty. Probably a slope, he muttered under his breath. He walked over, set his hand on the chair's handles, and found the floor perfectly level. He parked it against the wall, forcing a laugh. Exhaustion, that's all. He hadn't slept properly in weeks. Hallucinations weren't unheard of. But when he turned back, the hallway lights flickered once, a subtle stutter, and for a moment Daniel thought he saw someone standing at the far end. A man in a coat, tall, shoulders squared. The figure was gone by the time Daniel blinked. He told himself not to run, but his pace quickened anyway. By the time he returned to the nurse's station, he'd almost convinced himself it had been nothing. He poured another cup of stale coffee, sat down, and bent over his notes. Yet no matter how he tried to focus, his eyes drifted to the empty hallway beyond the glass window. The shadows seemed to be waiting. Long night. The voice startled him. It was Anderson, the night security guard, leaning against the counter with his ever-present thermos. The man was in his late 50s, grizzled, with a wry smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Just tired," Daniel said. "Feels like the building's messing with me." Anderson chuckled. "That's this place for you. Too many stories in these walls." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "You mean ghost stories?" The guard shrugged. "Depends who you ask. People say Dr. Carter still walks these halls. Him and his mother." The name made Daniel's stomach tighten, but he forced a scoff. "I don't believe in that." "Doesn't matter what you believe," Anderson said, sipping from his thermos. "Some things don't care if you believe in them." Daniel wanted to argue, but something in the man's tone silenced him. Anderson gave him a nod and walked away, boots echoing down the corridor. For a while, Daniel tried to push the conversation from his mind. He buried himself in work, updating charts, checking on patients. But around 3 o'clock, exhaustion began to pull at his limbs. He sat down in the empty break room, telling himself he'd just close his eyes for a minute. He dreamed immediately in the dream. He was back in the corridor, though it seemed longer, endless, stretching out into the dark. The overhead lights flickered, bathing the walls in a sickly yellow. At the far end stood a man, face shadowed, his coat soaked with blood. Beside him, an old woman sat in a wheelchair, her head lolling forward, grey hair hanging in strings. Daniel tried to move, but his feet wouldn't obey. The man lifted his head slowly, and Daniel saw his eyes black, bottomless, filled with something that wasn't human. "Daniel," the man whispered, though his lips never moved. Daniel woke with a start, his heart hammering, his body cold with sweat. The break room clock read 3:17. He rubbed his face, trying to convince himself it had only been a nightmare. But when he looked up, his breath caught. The break room window, the one that looked out into the hall, was fogged from the inside, and in the condensation, as though traced by an unseen finger, was a single word. "Carter." Daniel stumbled to his feet, the chair screeching behind him. He wiped at the glass, but the letters vanished instantly, leaving only his own pale reflection staring back. He didn't sleep again that night. The rest of his shift passed in a haze of jittery nerves. Every sound seemed magnified: the squeal of cartwheels, the hiss of doors opening, the cough of a patient down the hall. He finished his rounds, signed off the reports, and when dawn finally touched the hospital windows, relief washed over him like light after a storm. But even in daylight, as he walked out into the cool Boston morning, the unease clung to him. The word on the glass haunted his mind, etched deeper than any dream. Carter, he told himself. It was stress, exhaustion, maybe even a trick of his subconscious. But part of him knew better. Something in St. Mary's had taken notice of him, and it wasn't done yet. The following nights in St. Mary's blurred together like a fever dream. Daniel told himself that exhaustion explained everything. The half-seen silhouettes reflected in the windows, the soft thud of footsteps behind him when the hallway was empty, the weight of eyes that seemed to follow him as he crossed the darkened wings of the hospital. He had taken on too many overnight shifts, that was all. His body was tired. His mind was playing tricks, and yet, the pattern persisted. Every time he managed to close his eyes in the residence lounge, the same dream unfolded. A narrow corridor lit by flickering bulbs, the smell of disinfectant so sharp it stung the throat. And at the far end, a figure in a blood-stained coat. He never saw the man's face clearly, but the outline never changed at all. Broad-shouldered, hands dripping red as though freshly scrubbed in a sink of blood. A voice would always reach him just before waking. "You shouldn't be here." Daniel began avoiding sleep altogether. He would pace the halls at 3 in the morning, pausing to peer into empty operating rooms. Sometimes the surgical lamps would be left swinging as if someone had nudged them. Sometimes a tray of instruments would rattle despite no draft, no hand nearby. And every time, his chest tightened with the certainty that he was not alone. One night, while double-checking patient charts, he heard soft humming. The tune was unfamiliar, low and rhythmic, almost like a lullaby. Daniel followed the sound down to the unused East Wing, a part of the hospital closed years ago for renovations that never came. The humming stopped as soon as he stepped through the doorway. Dust lay thick on the floor, and the gurneys were shrouded in yellowed sheets. He felt foolish for even coming, yet the echo of that melody stayed lodged in his head long after he returned to his station. The next morning, over coffee in the cafeteria, Daniel tried to shake it off. He sat across from Emily, who had come to drop off some paperwork. Her eyes searched his face with concern. "You look like you haven't slept in days," she said. "I'm fine," Daniel replied too quickly. "It's just the hours." Emily tilted her head. "Or it's that place. You know what people say about St. Mary's?" He rolled his eyes. "Ghost stories. That's all." But she leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Daniel, I had a dream about David last night. He was standing in a hospital corridor, calling your name. He looked scared. Her words stuck with him all day. He dismissed them aloud, yet privately he wondered. David had died months earlier in a car accident, his body mangled on a rain-slick road. Daniel had been the one to identify him, to sign the papers. Could it be coincidence that Emily dreamed of him now, in the same halls where Daniel's own visions unfolded? Later that week, as Daniel finished a midnight round, a voice rasped behind him. "Still awake, Doc?" He turned sharply to find Anderson, the night security guard, leaning on his flashlight. The man was in his 50s, with weathered skin and eyes that seemed to alert for someone who had walked these halls for decades. "You scared the hell out of me," Daniel muttered. Anderson smirked. "You look jumpy. Seen something?" Daniel hesitated. He didn't want to feed into the gossip, but curiosity won out. "Do you know anything about this place? About a doctor named Carter?" The guard's expression hardened. He tapped his flashlight against his palm, considering. "Dr. William Carter. Yes. People still whisper about him. Brilliant surgeon, they say, but obsessed. He worked here in the 1950s. One night, something went wrong in the OR. Patient died. Carter lost his mind. When they found him, he was still in his blood-soaked coat, muttering about his mother." Daniel swallowed. "What happened to him?" "No one knows. Some say he hung himself in the East Wing. Some say he just vanished. But his name's been tied to this hospital ever since. Nurses refuse night shifts on certain floors. They claim Carter still walks the halls, looking for patients to finish his work on." Anderson's voice dropped lower. "I've seen him too. Just a glimpse. In the glass of the ICU doors. Tall, broad-shouldered, like you described." Daniel froze. He hadn't described anything. Anderson smiled grimly, as if reading his thoughts. "Be careful, Doc. This place remembers its dead. After that conversation, Daniel couldn't shake the image of Carter. His skepticism faltered. He began sneaking into the archives in the basement, rifling through boxes of brittle files. The deeper he dug, the stranger it became. Old reports spoke of missing patients, complaints filed by nurses about disturbances during surgery. One note, handwritten in faded ink, caught his attention. "The boy is not ready. Mother says he must wait." Daniel stared at the line until his vision blurred. The boy, mother, were these Carter's words, or the delusions of someone else entirely? The following night, Daniel sat in the lounge, fighting to stay awake. He must have dozed off, because when he opened his eyes, the room was different. The fluorescent lights buzzed, casting everything in a greenish hue. The walls were damp, streaked with mildew, and in the corner, a wheelchair creaked as it rolled forward on its own. A man stood beside it, broad shoulders, blood-stained coat, his face blurred as though smeared by smoke. Daniel's throat locked. He tried to speak, but no sound emerged. The man lifted a hand, and Daniel saw the long fingers trembling, red to the wrist. "Not ready," the figure whispered. "Mother is waiting." Daniel jolted awake, gasping. The lounge was normal again. The clock read 3:07 a.m. Sweat soaked his shirt. He staggered to the sink and splashed water on his face, but his reflection wavered. For an instant, another face hovered over his shoulder, older, hollow-eyed, mouth twisted in grief. The rest of the night passed in silence, but Daniel could no longer convince himself it was exhaustion. Something had taken root inside the hospital, and it was watching him. By the end of the week, he carried Carter's name like a curse. It was in his thoughts when he ate, when he walked, when he tried and failed to sleep. The hum of the hospital lights became Carter's breath. The rattling of carts in the hallway became his footsteps. And every time Emily called to check on him, Daniel heard David's name lingering unspoken between them. As if her dreams were warnings he refused to heed. The hospital was no longer just a workplace. It was a labyrinth, and Daniel knew he was already lost inside it. The night of the storm came without warning. Thunder rolled over Boston, shaking the hospital windows in their frames. Rain lashed against the glass, blurring the city lights beyond. Inside St. Mary's, Daniel tightened the drawstrings of his scrubs and tried to steady his breath. He had been assigned to assist in an emergency surgery. An accident victim rushed in with internal bleeding. The OR gleamed under surgical lamps, harsh white against the sterile walls. The anesthesiologist adjusted the mask over the patient's face, while nurses arranged the gleaming instruments in neat rows. Daniel stood at the side, gloved hands trembling slightly. He told himself it was the storm, the fatigue, the weight of too many sleepless nights. Not Carter. Not tonight. Dr. Hammond, the lead surgeon, entered briskly. "Let's begin." His voice was steady, commanding. For a moment, Daniel felt reassured. The rhythm of surgery was familiar, scientific, grounded in reality. He clung to it like a rope in a dark sea. Scalpel, clamp, suction, the language of order yet. As Hammond leaned over the patient, Daniel's stomach lurched. For just a heartbeat, the surgeon's face flickered blurred, smeared us, though another man's features overlapped. A taller figure, broad-shouldered, with eyes like pits. Daniel blinked hard. Hammond was normal again, barking instructions, unaware. Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears. He focused on his task, passing instruments, adjusting monitors. The beeping of the heart rate monitor filled the room, steady, steady, then faltered. The patient's pulse dipped, pressures dropping. The anesthesiologist called. "Clamp that vessel now." Hammond snapped. Daniel reached for the clamp, but his hand froze. A shadow stretched across the sterile floor, long and skeletal, though no one stood in its path. His gaze followed it upward, to the far corner of the oar. Dr. William Carter stood there, blood-soaked coat, hands red to the elbows. His presence was wrong, jagged, a smear of another world bleeding into this one. He didn't move, didn't speak, but Daniel felt his gaze like a scalpel on his skin. "Daniel," Hammond barked. "The clamp." He snapped back, fumbling to hand the instrument. But as Hammond reached for it, the surgeon's gloves dripped crimson too much, far more than the patient's wound could explain. The blood pattered onto the floor, splattering Daniel's shoes. No one else reacted. The nurses kept moving, faces calm, efficient. "Not real," Daniel whispered to himself. "This isn't real." The lights above flickered. The monitor shrieked as the heart rate spiked, then plummeted. In the chaos, Daniel heard another voice beneath the alarms, soft, deliberate. "Not ready. Mother is waiting." His head snapped toward the corner. Carter was closer now, at the edge of the surgical table. His face came into focus. Hollow eyes, skin stretched tight over bone, mouth curled into a grimace of grief. He lifted one trembling hand and pointed directly at Daniel. "Stop this," Carter rasped. "You don't belong here." Daniel stumbled back, colliding with a tray of instruments. Metal clattered across the floor. The others turned to glare at him, confusion and irritation flashing in their eyes, but none of them saw the figure looming at the table. "Daniel." Hammond shouted again, "Focus." But the room was shifting. The white walls stained yellow, peeling, as though decades of neglect surfaced in an instant. The sterile smell of antiseptic gave way to mildew, rot, and iron. The patient's chest rose and fell raggedly. But when Daniel looked down, he swore it was David lying there, his dead friend, pale and broken, eyes fluttering open to lock with his. "Help me," David mouthed. Daniel's knees buckled. "No, this isn't." Carter's voice roared through the room, louder than thunder, though his lips barely moved. "You cannot save him. You cannot save anyone. Mother is waiting." The lights burst overhead with a sharp pop. Darkness swallowed the oar, broken only by the weak glow of emergency lamps. Shouts erupted, nurses scrambling, Hammond cursing, but to Daniel, the chaos sounded muffled, as though underwater. All he could hear clearly was Carter's ragged breathing beside him in the dim red glow. Carter leaned over the patient, over David, his bloody hands poised as though ready to cut. "No." Daniel lunged forward, grabbing Carter's wrist. For the first time, he felt it solid, cold, pulsing faintly like something half alive. Carter's head turned slowly, and their faces were inches apart. His eyes were pits of despair, his mouth trembling. "She called me," Carter whispered. "Mother." She said he wasn't ready. None of them were. But I had to try. I had to finish. His voice cracked, a broken plea. Daniel's grip faltered. Was this a ghost, a memory, or a man begging forgiveness across decades? Behind them, the monitor flatlined. A long, piercing note filled the room. "No." Daniel gasped. Not him. Not David. But when he looked again, it was no longer David on the table. It was the nameless accident victim, body still, chest unmoving. The team surged into action, compressions, drugs, frantic orders. To them, Daniel was just standing frozen, eyes wide with terror. He looked back to Carter. The doctor was fading, dissolving into the shadows at the wall. Only his voice remained, echoing in Daniel's skull. "You'll see her soon. She's waiting for you too." And then he was gone. The lights blazed back on, blinding. The OR was whole against Errol White, ordered. Hammond barked commands, sweat beading on his brow. Nurses moved with precision. No blood on the floor, no rot on the walls, but the monitor stayed flat. The patient was gone. Daniel staggered back, ripping off his gloves. His breath came in ragged gasps, heart hammering. Hammond shot him a furious glare. "Get out if you can't handle it." He stumbled into the hallway, hands shaking. The storm outside rattled the windows. And there, reflected in the glass, he saw Carter's face one last time, eyes hollow, lips moving, sound less lie. Daniel turned away, but the words were already etched into his mind. "Mother is waiting." He pressed his palms to his temples, trembling. For the first time in his life, medicine gave him no answers. Only silence, only shadows. The hospital's hum filled his ears, deep and endless, like the sound of something vast breathing just beneath the walls. Daniel knew, with a sinking certainty, that St. Mary's was not finished with him, not yet. Thank you for staying with me through this story in the shadows. If you felt the chill, if the whispers followed you, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to Peace in the Shadows, so you'll never miss the next tale waiting in the dark. Every click, every comment keeps these stories alive, and perhaps keeps the spirits listening too. Until we meet again, stay in the shadows.